Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next in TTG's series of face-to-face programmes. I'm Pippa Jacks, Group Editor at TTG, and today I'm joined by Paul Charles, who is the CEO of luxury travel PR agency, the PC Agency, and has also been really steering a major travel industry campaign over the last couple of weeks against the government's disastrous quarantine rules. It's been backed by more than 500 travel and hospitality firms. It's not the only campaign that's been going on, but certainly one that's been very high profile over the last week. Obviously, Wednesday was a very disappointing day for everybody in the travel sector when, despite the valiant efforts of this campaign and others, Priti Patel went ahead and announced that quarantine measures are going to come into force from Monday, requiring all arrivals to the UK to self-quarantine for 14 days, with very few exceptions, meaning that, in effect, the UK is shutting down to both inbound and outbound travel just when Europe is starting to open up, which seems like madness to many of us. Paul, thanks so much for joining us. I know it's been an incredibly busy week and
Pleasure.
Very busy today. Can you talk us through the days leading up to Wednesday, exactly how close communication was between you and your campaign group members and government, and what sort of indications you were getting before Wednesday?
Well, as you say, Pippa, and thank you for having me on, by the way, and good morning, everyone. As you say, this is a disastrous measure. And most people who work in travel know it's disastrous. Those who are employed in the travel and tourism and hospitality sectors, which is nearly 4 million people in this country, will find out how much of a disaster it is, simply because of the number of layoffs that are likely. I'm sure we'll talk about that. Wednesday was, I'd say, more than disappointing. I would say it showed a government out of touch, and a government which is increasingly losing control of the coronavirus battle. On so many issues, not just in the travel industry, I think more and more people are questioning what this government is doing because they're not listening to anybody. They're certainly not listening to those in the travel and tourism sector at the moment. They say they're consulting, but they're not. At least they're choosing who to consult with so that those remarks fit their strategy if they have one. In terms of Wednesday and the build-up, the campaign was started by George Morgan Grenville, the CEO of Red Savannah, the tour operator. George had this idea. He wanted to write to Priti Patel. He was so angry about the fact that the government was seemingly going ahead with these quarantine measures. And quickly, through his contacts and just a few of mine, built up a strong list very quickly of like-minded people who feel that this is the wrong measure, the wrong time to be introducing it, and it should have been introduced in March. So we built up this list initially of 77 signatories. The letter went off to Priti Patel with those 77. She hasn't bothered to reply yet. And that list has grown as the anger has grown. And we're now at 500 companies, some big, some small, some in the middle, a real mixture, some individuals who feel very, very palpably angry that the government is proceeding with these quarantine measures, or so it seems at the moment.
So you didn't get a response to the letter. Were there conversations with any individual MPs that gave you any sense that perhaps the government might modify its approach or change tack, or did you just not really get anything before that Wednesday?
There have been a lot of conversations on and off the record, behind the scenes, with various officials in various departments, as well as MPs. And the MPs themselves are growing more rebellious about these measures. They certainly gave the Home Secretary a hard time in the Commons on Wednesday, and they are continuing to do so as conversations continue. But this is a government that seems to be steamrolling these measures through without any due regard. And it's interesting in the last few minutes that Willie Walsh at British Airways has said that he will consider legal action, and that's the right thing to be doing. This government needs to be stopped somehow because they're showing no regard for people's lives and livelihoods. It was an insult, actually, to the people who have died in this country that Priti Patel said to the Daily Telegraph this week, we owe it to those who've died to introduce quarantine. Well, actually, you would have owed it to those who died if you'd have introduced quarantine in March, when you should have done, and like most wise countries did. The reason that New Zealand and Vietnam and South Korea and others have had relatively low death rates, or zero in Vietnam's case, is because they introduced quarantine measures very early on. And yes, they may have had, in South Korea's case, some pockets since, but they realized that in a pandemic, you introduce a quarantine early to reduce the peak and reduce the number of cases. And for some reason, this government thinks it's the other way around, that you introduce a quarantine post-peak and when other countries have got lower death rates than we have. Well, the British people are not stupid. And at the moment, we're being treated as stupid people by a government that's completely out of touch.
So how can you try and explain what they're doing then, Paul? If you know, we've said ourselves we don't think the science supports this. What is the government's thinking? What's the agenda behind it?
It's a really good question, because we want to see the SAGE advisory group advice on these quarantine measures. They've not been published. The government have not talked about what advice, if any, SAGE was given. And in fact, SAGE themselves, or some members of it, are saying they were not properly consulted about these quarantine measures coming in. So I think the first question that Priti Patel needs to answer, and she is responsible for what's going to happen, the first question she needs to answer is, what is the SAGE advice that they have given the government ahead of these quarantine measures being introduced? Secondly, what is the agenda driving quarantine now? Why didn't you do it in March? Thirdly, is actually this a European agenda, a Dominic Cummings Brexit-led agenda to show Europe that Britain is actually quite powerful when it comes to the number of visitors to other countries? And by introducing quarantine, the government is using it as a tactic in the Brexit negotiations to show it's quite powerful in preventing European economies grow through tourism and visitors from Britain. And actually, I think that's what's really behind this quarantine, because there's no logic to putting it in place now. The obvious thing to do is to use test and trace properly and airport testing effectively to combine to capture people as they come into the country if they show any symptoms or have any symptoms in future. All quarantine is doing is destroying the economy of the UK and putting at risk up to 4 million jobs. So there's an agenda here from the government, and we believe it's actually a Brexit-led agenda.
Yeah. And it's very hard to try and make out what the hell they're thinking at the moment. But do you see sort of some connection between the quarantine measures and the FCO advice against all but essential travel overseas? Are you expecting any news on the FCO advice? Because a lot of this is sort of a bit academic if the FCO advice is still in place, isn't it? But have you had any indication that FCO advice might change soon?
Well, no, the indication is the FCO advice will continue at the moment. To give the government some credit in their apparent strategy on quarantine, they are talking about air bridges, and this was an idea that the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps floated. Seems to have been quickly shot down by Priti Patel about it, but he floated it, and we think that is the answer to have these travel corridors. Travel corridors would work very effectively. We've named countries, not every country in the world, but named countries around the world that could have a clear passage for passengers for visitors to go to and reassure people. The problem is what the government is doing is not giving any clear dates on when this might happen. So if the government said, we're putting in quarantine from this Monday, the 8th of June, and actually we will then have air bridges definitely in place from the 29th of June, when they're next due to review these measures, that would give some certainty and some hope and visibility to the travel industry and to the public. The public would know they could start booking for trips from the 29th of June without fear of their flight not happening or losing money. And that's what we need in the industry, is confidence again. But there's no visibility. There are no dates. There's no guarantee air corridors, travel corridors are going to happen. And the government simply is putting up a brick wall to the advice that the experts can give. And the evidence of that is the shambles of a meeting that was held yesterday between the Home Secretary and some airlines. And in fact, BA refused to attend wisely because they know this government's not listening.
So this was the travel roundtable that we'd heard about yesterday. Can you
That's right.
tell us any more about that? Who was there?
Well, there were some airlines there, and obviously groups like Airlines UK, representing airlines in the UK, ABTA, and so they were there to listen to what the government, had in mind. But Priti Patel, as I understand it, did not actually say any more. Gave no confidence, no certainty, no dates, and I think this is a government that shows no understanding of how the travel industry works. And as you know, it's made up of lots of smaller companies as well, who are having a terrible time during this pandemic and who will simply have to lay off people if there's barely any business this summer. I mean, the government isn't even saying when exactly you'll be able to stay overnight in a holiday home or a cottage on the coast or anything. So it may be July, but they've given no definite indication yet. So without a timetable, it's impossible for anyone in the industry to plan.
Yeah. It's interesting that Willie Walsh is threatening legal action. Do you think he might get somewhere with that?
Well, it's early days, but I think there's more to come on that, and I think he will. I think he'll find support. Clearly, the question is, what was the advice the government was given by SAGE before they went ahead and put these quarantine measures in place? Most Westminster people I talk to say there has been a clear argument between the Home Office and the Department of Transport. Grant Shapps didn't want to quarantine, Priti Patel did. Now, whether that's true or not, there are clearly voices in government that feel quarantine is not the way forward. And this appears to be, as I say, a Dominic Cummings-led Brexit approach to showing Europe during the negotiations how powerful the UK is in terms of visitor numbers. And we all know what credibility Dominic Cummings has right now.
Yes. Could you see other airlines or maybe, the other companies that have supported your campaign backing BA in those sort of legal threats and perhaps some kind of class action against the government in this way, or would that be unfeasible?
There is huge anger across the travel community, and I think you'll find there are many leaders of businesses, CEOs, owners who look at what BA are doing and say, good luck to you. Let's hope you succeed against the government in somehow stopping this quarantine coming into place. As I say, I think the legal justification is questionable. What is the evidence that they have? All the government could produce this week was a YouGov survey that they had produced saying something like 60% of British people were in favour of quarantine. Well, as we all know, surveys among sample sizes can be moved around to fit the story. I'm more interested in the scientific advice and the experts. And so far, the government has failed to produce any scientific evidence from SAGE to back up its need for quarantine measures. We'd be delighted to see the scientific evidence from all of the members of SAGE. Let's see what they're saying. But so far, the government has refused to show this. Yeah.
It's interesting you touched upon public opinion there, because I know the government has been saying that the public support this. I answered a very quick poll, I think it was on the Telegraph site, and of about 3,000 users, 70% said they wanted quarantine to be axed. So I don't know whether that was because they're users of the Telegraph's travel website, and these are travelling people that want to get back on holiday or whatever, but it's just really illuminating that it's possibly misleading statistics to say that the whole public is pro quarantine. Do you feel that consumer sentiment might actually be a little different?
Well, the government said in this YouGov survey it was 60% who were over 60% who were in favour of quarantine measures. I'd like to know what they were asking in detail, because when you ask a lot of people across the UK whether they do want to travel, the answer is yes. As the case numbers come down in the UK. I mean, the irony is our case numbers are the worst in Europe, sadly, and it's terrible how people have been affected, obviously, but they're the worst cases in Europe. Other countries are opening up because they've managed the crisis better. Yes, they are slightly further ahead in the cycle. They are two or 3 weeks ahead in the cycle, but they have a plan, and they've laid out very clearly when people in their countries can travel again. And that's what's needed in this country. We're not asking for Britain to be opened up tomorrow. We're asking for clear dates so that people know they can book a holiday to Italy, to Greece, to Spain, wherever they want to go, from a certain date, end of June onwards, let's say, so that the industry can take bookings. Mm-hmm. What the government is doing is squeezing the industry, hammering the last nail in the coffin for a lot of companies by not letting them sell because there's no visibility. Yeah. Why would you as a consumer at the moment book a holiday for July when you know the SCO advice is still there, the quarantine measures could be in place? You just won't do it. And that's why bookings have fallen off a cliff. And the government doesn't seem to be listening to the industry at all.
It's been interesting to see Virgin Atlantic announce, I think yesterday, that they're hoping to have some routes back on by 21st of July. I think Ryanair and EasyJet are also talking about having a proportion of their routes back in July. It's hard to see how do they know something we don't, or they're just being very bullish about trying to get things moving there, because it's difficult to see how many consumers would really be booking those flights at the moment.
Well, they are being bullish, and obviously airlines don't make money when their planes sit on the ground. And according to research by the data analytics company Cirium, there's 57% of the world's fleet is grounded at the moment. So that's no good for the airline industry. But they're planning flights because they believe that countries will open up, that actually maybe the government will let people fly during July. And also don't forget, there are some people that can fly, bizarrely, due to various measures in the policy the government's put forward. Certain key workers, certain tradespeople, diplomats and their families. So there are some people who are still flying very much around the world these days, albeit much smaller numbers. I think there's just a desire on the government to try and restrain movement. And fundamentally, I don't think and the whole group behind us believes they don't have a mandate to say that. There's not been a Commons vote. There's not been any public vote. It's just a decision seemingly from Priti Patel and Dominic Cummings. And that's the problem with it. There needs to be more visibility, more transparency about why quarantine measures were introduced. And that would help airlines, tour operators, hotels, travel companies of all shapes and sizes to be able to plan effectively. But at the moment, the industry is in freeze frame, and it's getting worse. Furlough schemes are starting to edge closer to their endpoint, and companies have to plan, and they need some cash coming in during the busy summer months. But at the moment, there's no sign of that.
And do you know how much work has been done on the air bridges side, whether they've seriously been sort of looking at that and getting that ready, or is it something they're just sort of throwing out as a possible solution that may or may not be really seriously being considered?
Well, there is a group who are looking at air bridges at the Department of Transport at the moment, with some of the teams from airlines, and the Foreign Office are involved. So they are looking at it, and they're monitoring which countries have lower rates of cases, so they're deemed to be safe. Pretty well every country in Europe has lower rates than Britain right now, so it's not hard to fathom. So I think, air bridges, air corridors, travel corridors, as Grant Shapps calls them, are things that may work. But even he can't give a date on when they may happen or which countries may be involved. And whilst Portugal say they're pretty advanced in their talks, there are not many other countries admitting that they're in talks with the government at the moment about having an air bridge. So it's going to take some time, and that's the problem. By the time you have an air corridor, a travel corridor in place, it's a lot further into the season, and it will take time to reassure consumers they can fly and before they book. So that's why we're getting later and later into the season, and it's slipping away, and the travel industry is deeply worried.
Yeah, and very difficult for the airlines to align their routes and capacity accordingly if they don't know where the corridors are going to be.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly short haul will be the first to start up in any major size. Long haul will be further away. You've got to rebuild confidence among consumers. And so from a consumer perspective, there will be some very, very good deals, and there already are out there, to fly, to get people flying again. And so from a consumer point of view, if they're confident, and a lot of consumers are confident about flying, they'll pick up a great flight and seat deal from EasyJet and BA and Virgin and others. The early birds will do very well. So the industry will pump prime to get that confidence back and to get people back onto planes. But I think in the industry, airports have to take more responsibility to reassure people that testing is being done at airports. And that's why quarantine doesn't make sense. If you have effective testing in place and a test and trace system, the two of those are the most effective at getting back to some sort of normality. There may be a second wave, there may be a third wave, there may be a fourth wave. At some point, you've got to keep the economy moving. You can't wait, otherwise there'll be no money, no economy to pay for a healthcare system. That's why quarantine doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So what's next for the campaign now from your point of view and George's point of view? What will you be doing today? I mean, over the weekend, this obviously comes into force on Monday, so not much time left, but what takes place now?
Well, I think we're taking soundings at the moment from the 500 companies who've signed up, very influential companies in many cases, and also many companies of a very small size who are worried. They're worried about their income and their workforce and their teams. And there's a lot of passion in the travel industry, as you know, from owners who've spent many years, hard graft, putting their time in to build up their businesses. And no wonder they're worried. So we're taking soundings from the group. We'll consider the BA move this morning to see what's happening there legally. And we won't be quiet. We won't go away. We will be making continuous calls and approaches to people in Downing Street and below. And you haven't heard the last of this group. It's going to make more noise and be effective, because the government has no idea why it's introduced these quarantine measures from a scientific point of view. They don't have a leg to stand on. And we're determined to make sure we find out why they think it's a sensible move, which it isn't.
Yeah. There's obviously the review coming up at the end of June. Do you think, even if you are able to get some of your messages to hit home a little bit more firmly, that it's likely that they wouldn't reconsider anything until the end of that 3-week period?
I think they will reconsider, actually. I think, or at least the sensible compromise, and if they want to save face, would be to start giving out some dates as to when air bridges, travel corridors will start, as to when they think quarantine measures could disappear, whether it's temporary and only for 3 weeks, when, crucially, consumers can start booking to travel again. If they came out and said next week, okay, the quarantine measures are in place, but we're happy for people to start flying again from the 29th of June to these 15 countries, then I think the industry would be much happier, because it could start selling tickets and holidays from that point onwards. So the government does have leeway to move. It can keep the industry happy and, crucially, save jobs. And surely that's what a government should be doing. Yes, they've put in place a generous furlough scheme. Yes, there's a loan scheme that many are taking advantage of. But at the moment, all the measures they're taking, which they say are in the name of science, are actually destroying the travel and tourism sector.
Yeah, incredibly, difficult to comprehend what the hell's been going on, and really interesting to hear your take on what has been going on behind the scenes, Paul. Thanks a lot for joining us, and as you know, the whole industry is sort of backing what the campaign's working on at the moment. Really hope that we'll get some more positive news over the next few days, early next week, that gives travel companies a little bit more light at the end of the tunnel, that they're going to get through this. So thanks very much, Paul. Thanks to you all for joining us, and we'll continue to follow this story, of course, on ttgmedia.com as it evolves.
Thank you, Pippa.
Stay safe. Thanks, Paul. Bye.